Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, available on Pacifica Radio and iTunes and Stitcher and SoundCloud and YouTube and at opednews.com/podcasts, where you have the complete archives of the show. My guest for this show, I'm really excited to have back. His name is John Perkins. He's famous for his book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, but he's been an author of about 10 books, and his newest one is Touching the Jaguar. And here it is. Touching the Jaguar, transforming fear into action to change your life and the world. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Rob. It's wonderful to be here with you again.
Yeah. So why'd you write this book?
Well, as you mentioned, so I've written 10, the 5 books on shamanism. Those were the first books I wrote, and Indigenous people, Shapeshifting, The World is As You Dream It, Psychonavigation, etc. And then 4 books on global economics, which are probably the more famous ones, Confessions of an Economic Hitman, having sold over 2 million copies in almost 40 languages. And, you know, I would speak at international economic conferences, and people would say, well, you're not the guy who wrote those woo-woo books on shamanism, are you? You know, you can't be the same John Perkins. And I would speak at shamanic events or New Age events, and people would say, you're not that dastardly guy who's an economic hitman, are you? And for me, there was always a close connection between those two genres, these two places. So I wrote, but they weren't explicit. So I wrote Touching the Jaguar to make it explicit. And really one of the main themes of the book is that our perceptions mold our reality. And that's also the basis for shamanism. And it's the basis for corporate, for what's going on in the corporate world, for our economy, advertising, marketing, that, you know, whatever we perceive has a huge impact on our reality. You know, it's the basis for modern psychology, for quantum physics. Basically everything human, all of our institutions are governed by our perceptions. And when enough people accept a perception or codify it into law, it has a huge impact on reality.
So what do you want the book to accomplish?
Well, you know, I talk a lot in that book, as I have in previous books, about how we've created a global system that's failing us.
You call it the death economy.
Yeah, the death, what I call it, what a lot of economists today are calling a death economy. It's an economic system based on the perception that the goal should be to maximize short-term profits for a few people, basically, regardless of the social and environmental costs. And that's giving, you know, executives the mandate, basically, to do whatever it takes to maximize short-term profits, including destroying the resource base upon which their long-term is dependent, destroying our environment, exploiting labor, corrupting politicians in one way or another, including legally these days. So, and it's created, you know, the situation where we have all these crises constantly, hurricanes, earthquakes, viruses, pandemics, income inequality, racial discrimination. All of these things have grown out of this terrible situation that we find ourselves in. So all of those are problems, but they're really symptoms of a bigger problem, which is our overall view of what it means to be successful human beings on this planet. We must change that and create a life economy, an economic system that actually pays people to clean up pollution, to regenerate destroyed environments, recycle, and come up with new technologies that are regenerative, not destructive.
Well, what I love about the book is that you bring in the perspective of indigenous people, the people who live in the forest, who live at the sacred headwaters of the Amazon, and who helped you to reshape your perspective. And you tell stories that are really cool stories about how you made that transition. But there's something, and I want to get more into the Jaguar, because the title of the book is Touching the Jaguar. But one thing I don't understand is you first touched the Jaguar when you were in, I guess, your early 20s, and you were a Peace Corps volunteer, and you got so sick, you felt like you were dying. and you were told you were dying, and you took ayahuasca, and which was given to you by a shaman illegally, and that changed your life. And you started being trained to become a shaman. The first gringo the shaman had ever worked on, because he'd had a vision about it. I'm just going kind of some of the stuff from your book. And what I don't understand is you went on to become an economic hitman. You didn't become a shaman then. It took you how long before you really woke up? What happened?
It's a great question, Rob. Well, you got to remember, this is when I had the experience with a shaman, it was 1969. I graduated from business school. I was deep in the Amazon as a Peace Corps volunteer, and I was dying. I couldn't keep any food down. I couldn't stand up without help. It was a 3-day terrible adventure to get out of there to the nearest medical facility. It was impossible for me to take that hike through the jungle and ride up to 10,000 feet into the Andes on a rickety old bus. I couldn't do it.
It's a riveting story in the book.
Well, yeah, I write in what's called narrative nonfiction. I like to tell stories, true stories, but write them in a way that are fun for people to read, not just boring economic stuff.
Yeah.
In any case, so what happened that night is that the shaman taught me I went on this vision quest, as you mentioned, and on that vision quest, I saw in the vision this jaguar in front of me, and the shaman said, "Touch the jaguar." And when I touched the jaguar, I basically heard a voice like my mother saying, "The food and drink will kill you." So I was eating some very strange foods, in my opinion, things like squirming white grubs. The people of the Amazon that I was living with, the Shuar people, they ate foods that were not at all like the ones I'd been grown up with in rural New Hampshire in the 50s and 60s. And people in the Amazon don't drink water from the rivers because they know the rivers are dangerous. They're filled with organic matter, falling trees. That's not dangerous to drink. So women make a kind of beer called chicha out of chewing and spitting the manioc root. You got to drink a lot of it to rehydrate in the tropics. So as I'm drinking this spit beer and eating these strange foods, what I realized is I hear this voice saying, "It'll kill you." Like my mother saying, "Oh my God, it'll kill you." And at the same time, I saw how robust and vibrant and healthy the Shuar are. My God, hunters and gatherers, they're so strong. And they live to be very old if they don't die in a hunting accident or something. And so I saw that night on that shamanic journey that it wasn't the food and drink killing me. It was organic, local, nutritious food. What I saw was that it was my mindset, my perception. And after that, the shaman required that I become his apprentice. I had no desire to do that. Never even heard of shamanism. There was no future in it, 1969. But he saved my life.
No bottom line.
Yeah. So I studied with him. And one of the most important things he taught me, he said, there's a jaguar that stands between you and changing anything in your life that you know you want to change or you ought to change. That jaguar, there's a voice or there's something telling you can't change. The food will kill you, that kind of thing. And if you run from the jaguar, it's a barrier. If you run from it, or if you don't confront it, it'll be there all your life. It'll chase you. It'll be there. But if you touch it, you break through the barriers. You get a new perspective. You get a new perception. And when you get that new perception, the food and drink is making them healthy. Therefore, it can make me healthy. That changes your reality. And so, I went through this training, but for 3 years I was in Ecuador in the Peace Corps. And then to answer the other part of your question, I went back to do what I was trained to do. I became an economist. I'd been to business school, and I did things that we now, I became chief economist. We did things that we now refer to as what economic hitmen do, things that are really exploitative of countries, that are promoting colonialism. But when I started in that career, for the first quite a few years, I thought I was doing the right thing, because in business school we're taught that when you do these things, when you invest a lot of money in infrastructure projects, and you hire our corporations to build those projects, you help the economy of the country grow. And statistically, we can prove you do. The GDP grows. And so I bought into that. I thought I was doing the right thing for many years, but then I began to see that those statistics are totally skewed in favor of the rich. GDP does not measure overall prosperity. It measures the rich. So as an example, the United States, 3 individuals have as much wealth as half the population of
Well,
the
the
United
other
States.
thing is that these statistics and economic measures leave out what Chomsky has described as externalities.
Correct.
The safety of the world, the nature of the environment, the happiness of people. Those are all cost factors that are not included when you look at the balance sheet.
That's correct. And I think, our tax laws don't include those things. Nothing includes those things. But also our statistics, our measurement, so as I mentioned, if we get 3 people in the United States have as much wealth as half the population. If those 3 people last year made 10% return on their investments and half the population lost 3%, you'd still show a gain of GDP of something slightly under 5%. So after a while, I began to understand this, and eventually I got out of being an economic hitman and decided to devote the rest of my life to trying to expose this perception, and it's only a perception, remember. So we can transform the death economy to the life economy by moving from a perception of maximizing short-term profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs, to a goal of maximizing long-term benefits for people and nature.
How did you wake up? Why did you wake up? What happened? You'd had that training, you'd had that experience, but you went back and you became an economic hitman, basically working for the predatory death economics and capitalism. What changed? What led you to that epiphany? Was it an epiphany?
Yeah, well, there was a final epiphany, but leading up to that epiphany was the fact I'd been a Peace Corps volunteer. I'd been downstream of the dams that destroy fishing and destroy the water supply of the people downstream. So I'd seen the other side. I'd lived with and worked with the people at the bottom of the economic scale. And I spoke fluent Spanish. And I became friends with Omar Torrijos, the head of state of Panama, who was strongly opposed to what we were doing and was trying to convince me to turn things around. And he, along with Jaime Roldos, the president of Ecuador, they were really, really demonstrative in letting me and telling me these things. And so over time, I accepted it, and I began to look into how these statistics are compiled, the very ones that I was working with, that I'd been brought up with all my life. It took a while, and I have to say, Rob, that once I understood how bad the system was and what a lie it was, how we were using this false perception, I didn't want to understand it. I didn't want to touch that jaguar. I'd grown up the son of a teacher in a boys' boarding school in New Hampshire. We had a small house the school gave us. I ate with 200 boys from the time I was 4. Wasn't wanting for any of the basics of life, but my dad basically made no money. And I'm surrounded by extremely rich boys who tell these stories about Paris and Buenos Aires and everything. And I always wanted that. And now suddenly I'm living that. I've got a huge expense account. I'm chief economist. I've got a staff of up to 50 people working for me. And I'm traveling first class around the world, meeting with presidents, making a great salary. So once I understood the problem of the system and what I was doing, I didn't want to understand it. I didn't want to touch that jaguar.
You were addicted.
What?
You were addicted.
I was trapped. Yes, I was trapped. And that's so common in our system. I can't tell you how many people now, and I'm giving these talks, and come up to me afterwards at a reception or sometime and say, I feel trapped in this system too. And of course, the other thing is you accumulate debt. You buy a car, you buy a house, you get married, whatever. You start accumulating debt, and so you feel that you can't get out. There's a trap there, and there's also the fear. And there's also at the same time all these voices like the human relations department, or human resources, we now call it. I hate that expression, human resources. But they're telling you all the time that what you're doing is the right thing. You'd be crazy to leave. You'd be crazy to get out. So they make it kind of hard. They make it very hard. They made it very hard on me.
And the story you tell where you first touched the jaguar, when you did, it was your mother's voice that was making you die, basically. It was the programming from your parents.
Yes, my parents, but the whole culture that I'd grown up
Oh, yeah.
with. Yeah, you know, the idea that there's certain foods and you know, in the 50s and 60s in New Hampshire, in the winters, you didn't have a lot of choices. Nobody had gardens. Unless you were really wealthy, you couldn't bring in fresh foods from Florida or California or someplace. We were eating a lot of canned foods. And then when frozen foods came along, we thought that was God's gift to humanity. And we had, you know.
Oh, and the big tech discovery then was frozen dinners in aluminum trays.
Oh my God, I was so ecstatic when you could get that, you know, turkey and dressing, just like Thanksgiving, but all you had to do was put it in an oven for a few minutes. It wasn't very healthy, we now know probably, but you know, the food I was getting in the Amazon was a lot more healthy. That was very healthy food when you come right down to it. Screaming white grubs that you take fresh out of the tree. High nutrition, man. You know, that's local. That's as organic as you can get.
So I want to, you know, I have always really liked Joseph Campbell and The Hero's Journey, and I'm sure you know it. And the jaguars you talk about sound like they're archetypal characters for indigenous people, not in the Western culture, but in the indigenous world, in South America. They sound a bit like the threshold guardian in The Hero's Journey. And so I'd like to know more about their mythic and archetypal nature, and as the shamans and the indigenous people think of them.
Yeah, it's a beautiful story. And there's, you know, if you go back to the Aztec legends of Mexico, or the Toltec of Mexico, or the Maya of Guatemala and Honduras and Salvador and Central America, or the Incas of the Andes, or deep into the Amazon, you find a number of different legends about the jaguar. But in all of them, the jaguar is this very powerful animal, very beautiful, that can be scary, but it's also a gift giver. And you keep running into stories. If you start to ask questions about the jaguar, you keep hearing stories about jaguars that have saved people's lives. So a hunter who's deep in the forest and breaks his leg, can't move, can't get help, and is starving to death. And the jaguar comes up and leaves a dead animal, a rabbit, you know, a small rodent with an agouti that's considered a delicacy, delivers it to this injured person, who then can build a fire by literally rubbing sticks together and roast this animal and survive. And so, and there's many other types of stories like this. Jaguars that pull drowning people out of rivers. Jaguars are great swimmers. They're water cats. There's all kinds of stories, and when you hear so many of these, you got to believe there's a basis for them. But in any case, the mythology is that the jaguar can be scary, but if you allow it to, it'll also be a gift giver. And so this idea of touching the jaguar, that there's a barrier there. And the shaman actually described this as, you can have a reality, which let's say is spit beer and squirming white grubs. There's a bridge, we call it perception bridge, that the perception is it's killing you. The food and drink are killing you. The voice saying that takes you to a new reality of being sick. But you have that same reality, and you cross and you go to the bridge. Standing on the bridge is a jaguar that says, hey, you got to listen to your mother's voice, or whoever's voice that is. It says it'll kill you. You got to listen to it. But if you go and touch the jaguar says, oh, you don't have to listen to that. Just look around you at the people you're living with, the schwa. They're drinking this spit beer and eating these squirming white grubs, and they're incredibly healthy. And so you change that perception, you go to a new reality, which is health. And we can take that throughout everything. You know, when I talk about transforming a death economy to a life economy, in both cases, you've got a world that's filled with natural and human resources. If the perception is you've got to use those resources to maximize short-term profits, regardless of the social and environmental costs, takes you to a death economy. If you start to look at something different, the jaguar says, no, you can't change the economic system. It's ingrained. That's just the way it is. That's what all those economists have told us for years now. But if you touch that jaguar, it says, oh no, all you gotta do is change your perception. It's not about short-term profits of short-term materialistic gains. It's about long-term benefits
Okay, so
for
we need to take
everybody
a brief,
and nature. That then takes you to a life economy.
we need to take a brief pause for show ID. And my guest for the show is John Perkins. He's an author and an activist who's done 10 books on global intrigue, shamanism, and transformation, including Touching the Jaguar, Shapeshifting, and the classic with millions sold Confessions of an Economic Hitman. And he's got a new book out now, Touching the Jaguar, Transforming Fear into Action to Change Your Life and the World. And, you know, I said that I think that Touching the Jaguar is like Threshold Guardians in the hero's journey, because Threshold Guardians are there to scare you, but they're also there to keep away people who aren't ready. And when you touch the Jaguar, in a sense, it's like embracing the Guardians almost. And so, and not everybody is ready. Some people are going to listen to the Jaguar saying, that's bad, stay away, and they're gonna. I mean, you took ayahuasca the first time. How do people touch the Jaguar? How do they go to that next level and touch the Jaguar to discover that there are other possibilities, that there are different perceptual bridges?
So, yeah, so Rob, that's a wonderful question. And there are many portals. Ayahuasca is one, just one. And, you know, it can be a powerful one, but it requires that you do a lot of work afterwards. And I'm a little concerned now because there's a lot of people taking ayahuasca almost like a social process, almost like an addiction in a way. It's not physically addictive, but socially it may be. Oh, a guy asked me the other day, he said, yeah, I've taken ayahuasca 20 times in the last year. How many times have you taken it? And I said, well, the last time I took it was 10 years ago, and I'm still processing that. So, it's one opener, but there's many. The Mayan people of Central America use fire ceremonies that do essentially the same thing, and very, very powerfully.
Fire ceremonies?
Yeah, incredible fire ceremony. In fact, I had a person who was in the Amazon with me last August, did ayahuasca, a very important experience. Then went to Guatemala and hung out with me with the Mayan shamans. And I take groups every January to Guatemala to the Mayans. You can go to JohnPerkins.org and find out more. He did this fire ceremonies, and at the end of the trip, he made an announcement to the whole group. He said, the fire ceremony was more enlightening and more powerful for him than the ayahuasca, which isn't to put down ayahuasca at all, but it is to say there's many portals. And in the book, at the end, after telling these stories that you mentioned, it also leads to a process that everybody can do every day or once a week, however often we want, for about 10 minutes, that goes into the same process that opens that portal. How do we open the portal? And incidentally, that process is based on 5 questions that actually, for me, came out of Joseph Campbell's teachings about the importance of following our bliss. And when you come right down to it, all of this is about opening ourselves to what we most want to do for the rest of our lives. We ask ourselves the question, what will bring us the most satisfaction, the greatest joy for the rest of our lives? And that's the first of 5 questions that then lead us into a process that is basically the same trip that you could take on ayahuasca or with drumming or with fire ceremonies or whatever techniques they use. Throughout the world, shamans, all believe that perception molds reality. The language that they use to portray that is different. The Amazonian people use these sacred plants like ayahuasca. The Mayans use fire ceremonies. Up in the Andes, they use sacred stones from the volcanoes and eggs and plants that they rub on you. You don't ingest them. They're beginning to commercialize now ayahuasca, which I think is dangerous. But all over the world, it's different. In the United States, the equivalent are psychologists or psychotherapists of all kinds, and they use words. It's the same thing. How do you use words to help create new perceptions, to mold new realities in people, to help people get rid of addictions, things they don't want, or to help them move more deeply into what they really do want? So there's these different techniques. And yeah, ayahuasca helped me at that one particular time. And I was trained as an ayahuasca shaman. But I have to say that since then, I find, when I every day or every few days, I go into the same process that I describe in the book to overcome jaguars. And, you know, I'm sure you've had plenty of jaguars, Rob, in order to get to where you are in the media that you do as a host on this beautiful program that you have. You know, and you confront one jaguar and you touch it and you change your perception, that changes reality. But eventually another one's going to come along, you know, and that's what gives us power, actually.
Well, what's fascinating is once you've touched a jaguar, I think it changes your relationship to jaguars, which are threats to you, basically. So once you've done it, I would imagine in terms of thinking about touching jaguars, it's going to be a lot easier to face challenges and stand up to fears or when you're told no.
Yeah, it becomes a habit. And that's why it's good to actually make a daily practice out of it for 7 or 8 minutes a day. That can be very good. So I'll give you an example. When I was in high school, prep school, I was a really good writer. I was editor of the newspaper. I won a short story prize. And I went to college and was an English major. And I worshiped my freshman English teacher. He was a published writer, famous. He hated my work. He criticized it. He didn't give me anything above a C. I quit college, partially to a large degree because of that. Wow. When I went back to college eventually, I studied economics, business administration. I avoided it. I'd been so hurt by this guy's opinion that I avoided writing. That's a big jaguar. I stopped doing what I most love in life. I love to write, but I stopped doing it.
Great at it too.
and thank you. And then I realized after I went in the Peace Corps and I had this experience and I said, well, I'm going to apply that to writing. I touched that jaguar. And what I saw was that this English professor was just a human being. I mean, that's his judgment that he didn't like my writing. And it struck me that this English professor also was highly critical of Bob Dylan's writing. Bob Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature. So I touched that jaguar and say, hey, you know, like, no, I can write. It's just this guy's, that's just his opinion. And that jaguar helped me move forward. Well, many years later, when Confessions of an Economic Hitman, after I had written it, the whole book, it goes out to publishers. It was rejected by 39 publishers. I got 39 rejection letters. And after about the 7th one, the temptation was to say, well, nobody likes my writing. It's no good. Nobody wants to publish this book. But I remembered, I touched that, and I'd come up with, I'd get a rejection letter and say, well, that editor, she had a fight with her husband at breakfast, and she just threw everything into the rejection file. Or this editor just doesn't like my politics. or I would, I'd come up with these scenarios to basically would tell myself, they're just human beings. It's not about my writing. It's just I haven't got through to the right person yet.
What was the publisher? What was the publisher who ended up seeing that it was a winner?
Barrett Kohler, it was a small house in San Francisco at the time. This was 2003. The book was published in late 2004. They're now very, very well-known publishers, particularly.
And they published this book too.
Yes, I love them. They're the first publisher in the world to become a B corporation and a benefit corporation, to actually walk the talk of being socially and environmentally responsible. And they've, since then I've also had Random House, Penguin. I've been published by the big guys. There's nothing to compare with Barrett Kohler for their incredible dedication to their writers, to do. They're great editors, great coaches. They think of their editors more as coaches than editors. And then at the end, they also have copy editors, as everybody does, to make sure you crossed all the T's. But I love working with them. I absolutely love working with them.
So I'm curious, tell me more about how you wrestled with the jaguar when it came to publishing that first book. As a writer, did you have an agent pushing the book then, or no?
Yes, fortunately, I had an agent, a great New York agent named Paul Fedorko, who stood by me. And I say I get 39 rejection letters, but I will have to say that Paul intercepted most of those. They went to him, and we'd talk on the phone. He'd say, well, you know, we get 4 more letters back from publishers, and they all love your book, but it's just not quite right for Random House right now, or whatever. And so he helped me touch that jaguar. He was touching his own jaguars in the meantime. And you know, it's funny because after Barrett Kohler published the book in hardback and it went on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed there for ultimately a year and a half, then these publishers that had rejected it before went into a bidding war to buy the paperback rights from Barrett Kohler. They owned the paperback rights, not me. They made the money off of it, you know, like, Random House and Penguin went into this huge bidding war and ended up Penguin paying $1 million or so, a lot of money. And they could have got it for free a year earlier. But and people think I made a lot of money off the book. I really didn't. Most of it, a lot of it went to Barrett Kohler, but I was very grateful. I'm glad it did. It helped them to create a real huge, important presence in the world. And again, like you say,
they're a wonderful publisher.
They are wonderful.
Yeah.
So, but it was interesting that, you know, the editor in chief, the head editor of Broadway Books, Random House, lost his job, partly I think because he rejected my book. But
I got another question for you. You're basically a guy who did some really cruddy stuff.
Yes.
And then you woke up and you became a good guy. And you cast light on the dark world where you had been an operative, and you've tried to make a real difference in the world. And I think that's wonderful. I think that when people wake up and they go from doing bad stuff to doing good stuff, I think that they deserve a lot of credit for it. But I also, as a publisher at Op-Ed News, where I've published over 100,000 articles, and there are, you know, so many commenters, a lot of people will go, well, he's a bad guy. He was an economic hitman. We shouldn't forgive him. And you know, another guy like that I think of is Wendell Potter, who was the publicist for the healthcare companies, who was designated to attack Michael Moore's movie Sicko. He had an epiphany and he woke up and he's become an advocate for single payer and healthcare for all now. And he's just an amazing, good guy. But I held a conversation with him down at the Philadelphia Free Library with a couple hundred people present. And the guy stands up and goes, I don't care what you're doing now. You were a bad guy. I'm just curious, have you encountered that kind of situation? And how do you advise people? I mean, in your book, you talk about how you talk to CEOs who want letters saying, we're not going to buy your product anymore until you behave yourselves better. Have you had any experiences like that? And would you have advice for people who may be in the same position you were in before you really fully woke up and took charge of your life in a positive way?
Yeah, you know, I think what's important to recognize here is I did believe I was doing the right thing for a long time. It's what I was taught in business school. It's what the World Bank promoted and still does. And business schools still teach these things about GDP. There are changes happening, and partly because of books like mine and others that have come forward. I think that then once I understood what I was doing, I didn't want to, like I said earlier, and there were all these forces in play to convince me that I was doing good, even though in my heart, and I went through this process. And I think there's a lot of people in this position, but those who come through, look at Daniel Ellsberg, who published the Pentagon Papers. You know, he had a bad job, and then he saw what was wrong with it and turned it around. I think that these models of people like that, and people have told me, they say, hey, John, you know, you're a great model of how people can turn around. Yeah. And I think that gives us a lot of hope. We change our perception, and then we change our reality. And so this is how we move forward. And you know, my daughter was recently asked for in an interview, she's in her 30s now, you know, how do you feel about all the bad things your dad did? And she said, well, I know my dad sometimes bothers his conscience a little bit, but she said, I'm really glad he did them, because now he has the credibility throughout the world and of being able to go out and expose a system that he totally understands. If he had just become a journalist or a writer and studied these things, that would be one thing. But having lived it, having been in the trenches, having been in the mouth of the jaguar, he understands it. And truthfully, like, I was speaking at a big economic forum of about 12,000 people in St. Petersburg, Russia, not too long ago, and Putin was there, and the CEO of the Chase Bank, and so on. It's just an amazing group of people that I was speaking there, and I became friendly with Putin's chief economic advisor, Sergei Glashov. And Sergei, who speaks very good English and has written in English and likes my books and has been very critical of both the American and the Russian systems. And Sergei said, I think it's just very, very important that people like you and I, him, come forward, and we who understand the system and can speak the language come forward and try to promote alternative to the system. And I have to say, Rob, I'm not in any way defending Putin or the Russian system at all. What I'm saying is that I think that there is this recognition that in order for change to happen, we have to understand the problems that we've created in the past. And my experience, it was only 10 years, I was chief economist, economic hitman. Those 10 years were ones that gave me a tremendous insight into the system that is ruining the planet now, and as we know it, and creating so many of the problems that we have today. And being inside that system and being able to speak the language of the people that are in places of power, as well as telling stories that I hope everybody who reads it, whether they understand economics or not, as a theory, can really get it. I'm grateful that I'm in the position to do that. If I had it to do over again, would I do it any differently? I don't know. I really don't know, because yeah, I sometimes I wish I hadn't done the things that I did. But again, nothing that I did was illegal. Everything that I did was sanctioned by the institutions that I'd been educated under. And then I saw the light. And, it took a while. Like I said, I didn't want to confront that jaguar for a long time because of the life I was leading. But I was understanding that I wasn't happy anymore. I didn't enjoy doing what I was doing. And then I had this one moment, an epiphany, you might call it, after 10 years in that job as chief economist. Took a vacation, rented a little sailboat in the Virgin Islands, and I anchored it off St. John Island. And late one afternoon, I rowed the dinghy ashore, and I climbed up this hill to the ruins of an old sugar plantation up there. Beautiful, surrounded by bougainvillea. I'm looking out over the Caribbean, the sun setting. It's just totally idyllic. And I'm thinking, gosh, this is so beautiful. And then it struck me that whole plantation was built on the bones of thousands of slaves. And then I had to think, well, the whole hemisphere is built on the bones of millions of slaves, our own indigenous people, as well as Africans that have been put in chains and carried on awful ships here. And then I had to admit that I really had to look at and admit that I was a slaver. I didn't use chains, but I've been enslaving people in debt and in this colonization process of exploiting other countries and resources and people. And at that moment, I made the decision I would never do it again. And I went back from that vacation and quit. And then over time, I also made the commitment that I would do everything I could to try to turn the system around, to use what I had learned and to use the vocabulary that I understood to do everything I could to convert this death economy into a life economy.
You've really given me an incredible insight, because the understanding that some people have to go through that dark phase of their life in order to develop the power and credibility to bring about change. That's what I think you just said.
Yes, and I would say that right now, our whole nation and the whole world, in fact, is facing something very dark. this coronavirus is making us face the fact that we've put a tremendous amount of money into self-defense in many, many countries, especially the United States, and through systems that are basically pretty archaic. Who needs aircraft carriers in a time of drones and cybernetics? I mean, and we have not put our money into defending ourselves from an invisible virus.
Well, I want to get into that because that's the third part of the interview I want to do. But I want to cover a little bit more. How do we get these people to go through the kind of process that you went through and that Wendell Potter went through, going from being advocates for the power system, for the death economy, to wake up, to row that dinghy to the island and climb the mountain and see how they were the slave masters?
I think, Rob, that a lot of people, including ones in very high positions, have been going through this process already. But many of them are in the phase that I was in when I recognized that it was wrong, but I was trapped in the system. And they need help getting out of being trapped.
How?
Well, I've had so many executives tell me, they're like in St. Petersburg during the receptions, Russians love their vodka. They love receptions. After you give a talk, there's a big reception, and then you get to meet the people you've been talking to, and some of them are very high up CEOs. And many of these CEOs over time at that meeting and many others have said, I have grandchildren, I have children, I have grandchildren. I want to make my company greener, but I know that if I lose a 0.5% of market share or my stock prices go down, my major stockholders will fire me, and they will replace me with someone who only cares about the stock prices or market share. And so please tell all your audiences to send me emails, tweets, whatever, however you want to do it. Send something out that says, hey, I love your product. Don't diss it. I love your product, but I'm not going to buy it anymore until you pay your workers in India a living wage, or you clean up the environmental messes you've created, or whatever. So if
Stop advertising on Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, and they say, so send that to me and send it to all of those social networking circles and ask them to send me that email, and ask them to send it to all their social networking circles. And the CEOs will say, when I've got 100,000 of these, I can take these to my main investors and say, we've got to listen to our customers, but you've got to push me. And in fact, Rob, I mean, we've seen B corporations, benefit corporations, the rise of conscious capitalism, the Green New Deal. Last August, 192 of the world's most powerful executives came together at the Business Roundtable, and they basically made a statement: we should no longer be driven by short-term profits, and they basically enforced the life economy. But now we, the customers, their customers, their employees, their investors, all of us, we've got to push them to go forward with the vision they have. So they have the perception that they've got to change. Now we've got to somehow help them turn that into a reality where they don't get fired by doing this, but they move forward. And so it is important what every one of your listeners buys, how you shop, but it's not enough. When you choose not to buy something from some corporation, let them know why you're not buying it from them, because they're doing something wrong. And the company that you do buy from, let them know that they're headed in the right direction. They may not be perfect, but they're doing all they can to do it. Get the message out and get it out to all your social networking circles.
And also tell the ones that you're not buying from what they need to do in order to get you buying again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I love Franklin Roosevelt at the end of World War II, met with the heads of the auto industry unions. And at the end of the meeting, as they're leaving the Oval Office and he's shaking their hands, he said to them, I think, I'm paraphrasing, but I think you now know that I'm with you. But now you got to go out and convince your rank and file to force me to do the right thing. I think that's so important that Roosevelt recognized that even though he believed in doing the right thing, he couldn't do it unless he got pushed by the electorate.
Obama said the same thing.
Yeah, that's true. He did. Yes.
So we need to take a brief break again, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about coronavirus. And I want to talk to you about the time that you came really close to touching a jaguar for real. And my guest for the show is John Perkins. He's an author and activist whose 10 books on global intrigue, Shamanism and Transformation, including Touching the Jaguar, Shapeshifting, and the classic Confessions of an Economic Hitman, have been on the New York Times bestseller list for more than 70 weeks, sold over 2 million copies, and are published in 35 languages. His website is JohnPerkins.org, and his new book is Touching the Jaguar, Transforming Fear into Action to Change Your Life in the World. So you had a really close encounter with a jaguar.
Well, yeah, I've had a few actually, but the most recent one, the one I think you're referring to that I describe in detail in the book, was just a year or so ago in the Amazon. I'm paddling a kayak down a river in the Amazon. I come around a bend and there's a huge adult jaguar swimming across the river. As I mentioned earlier, jaguars they love it. They like to swim. And I actually had to back paddle not to hit this jaguar. I was about to hit it in the river, and it got out of it looked at me. And just kept swimming on, like, who cares about you? It climbed up the riverbank. It looked at me again, then it shook itself, and then it went into the forest. And I went back then to the dock where the Ayhuasca guys, these indigenous people, neighbors of the Shuar that I was with, were standing, waiting for me. They were just there, hanging out. And I told them, and they got in a dugout canoe. They took me back to where the jaguar climbed out of the river, and they got us all out of the canoe, and they found the jaguar's tracks in the mud, and we all touched them, and they said, we're touching the jaguar. And we got back in the canoe, and one of them, the youngest guy, said to me, he said, you've touched that jaguar. He said, your people need to touch the jaguar. And I said, what do you mean? He said, your people know that they're in the process of destroying life as we know it. They're destroying these rainforests, but they're destroying life as we know it on this planet. And you've got to help them touch that jaguar. And I was in the middle of writing this book at that time. I was just about finished writing the book, but I had finishing touches to put on, including that story, which I put in the book. And it just seemed so significant to me, like this jaguar had reached out to me and given me a message. And that's a little woo-woo sounding, but that was just the perception that I told myself, that this jaguar, and you can see one right behind me here, this jaguar I took encouragement from it. Whether the jaguar meant to do that or not is not the issue. The perception I got was, yeah, go ahead, this book's going to do well. And the book, actually, its official publication date was June 16th, which in the Mayan calendar is the day of the jaguar.
Oh, wow. Cool. Yeah. We need to have people seeing jaguars. I would imagine that in this archetypal tradition, you don't sometimes even see the jaguar. If you're not ready, you may not even see the jaguar, or if you see it, you just run away scared rather than being ready and touching it and then going through the jaguar to the next stage of your life, really.
Yeah. So that's, I recognize that. And that's why in the book, I mentioned these 5 questions, and if it's okay with you, I'd just like to review the 5 of them quickly.
Sure. Yeah. Great.
So, and I'll use a couple of experiences, my own as a writer, and a friend of mine who's a carpenter, who's kind of, that's kind of the opposite end of a writer, not exactly opposite, but it's different. But anybody can apply this, whether you're a teacher or a parent or whatever you are. So the first question is, what do I most want to do for the rest of my life? Joseph Campbell's, what will bring me the greatest bliss, the greatest satisfaction for the rest of my life, beginning today? What do I want to do? And the second question is, how does that help other people? Because we're all happier when we help somebody else. And that could be one other person, or it can be the whole world. So for me, the answer to the first question is, I want to write. I love to write. For a carpenter, it's I want to work with wood. The second question, my answer is, I'm going to write stories that inspire people to transform a death economy to a life economy. And the carpenter's answer might be, I want to use sustainable materials to help the world. And the third question is, what jaguar stands in front of you, stopping you from doing this? What is the voice? What's telling you? Who's telling you that you can't do this? And for a writer, one of those voices may be, oh, I just don't have enough time to write in the day. I'm too busy doing other things. For the carpenter, it might be, oh, my clients are going to say they don't want to pay more for sustainable materials. And so the fourth question is, when we touch that jaguar, how does it change our perception? For a writer, then, you could say, well, oh, I can get up half an hour earlier in the morning and write, or I could watch an hour or less of television at night and write, maybe only 3 days a week, but I'm going to commit to writing, to changing one of my habits a little bit so I have time to write. For the carpenter, the jaguar says, hey, tell your clients that that's not a cost. By using sustainable materials, they're investing in their future, their own future, their children's future. It's not a cost, it's an investment. And the fifth question is, what actions do I need to take every day? And for a writer, it's got to write. Maybe it's one page, maybe it's one paragraph, but every day you got to write. And for the carpenter, it's get out there and build with sustainable materials and tell your clients. You don't have to write poetry. You don't have to be eloquent. Just say, hey, look, I just built you this cabinet, and you can show it to your kids and say it's all built with sustainable materials because you want them to have a better life in the future. You want the forest to be around in the future for them to enjoy too. So I think we can all run through this process, Rob.
They're great questions.
Yeah, and it's exactly what, Touching the Jaguar is all about. It's exactly the experience that I had on Ayhuasca back in 1969. It's the same process. You don't need to take a plant. You don't need to shake a rattle. You may want to do all of those things. I'm not saying you shouldn't, but I'm also saying that you can every day go into this, and the actions you take can be as simple as sending out a tweet, or as complex as running for president of the United States.
So let's talk a little bit more about Touching the Jaguar. And right before you touch it, what are the feelings? What do you experience before you touch the jaguar? You describe in your ayahuasca experience that this jaguar appeared before you. What did you feel at first? What did you think? And then you touched the jaguar, and what happened? How did you change? How did you feel differently?
Well, first of all, I'm in this trance state, and my eyes are closed, and I'm seeing an amorphous form in front of me, something just kind of wiggling around. And the shaman says, touch the jaguar. And I totally panicked. I'm in the middle of the jungle. The jaguars around us. I know that. I've heard them at night. And I open my eyes and I look all around like, where's the jaguar? And the shaman says, no, close your eyes. And so I was terrified. The first reaction was I was terrified. He says, no, close your eyes and see the jaguar. And now this amorphous shape shifts into a jaguar, and I see it, and I'm sort of afraid of it, like, what's it going to do? And then he says, touch it, and I slowly reach out, and my feelings, and it's looking more and more benign, and I touch it, and I hear this voice: the food and drink will kill you. And then I see immediately how healthy the schwa are, and so I went through that process. And I think, when we look at, if I describe another jaguar, the jaguar of the teacher telling me that I was a lousy writer, I felt terrible. I stopped. I quit college. I gave in. When we see the jaguar in front of us, we're presented with the opportunity to break through it, to touch it, to go through, or to break down. And for a long time, I broke down. I didn't write anymore. I just gave up. I felt terrible about writing. I didn't want to write anymore. I studied business administration.
So what did you feel differently when you actually were ready to touch the jaguar? How did it change? What was the change in the feeling, the mental?
Yeah, I at some point I realized that I'd been very successful as a chief economist. I'd been good at convincing leaders of countries to take these loans. And often, but other leaders rejected me. They didn't do it, or there were a lot of obstacles. But I didn't take them personally. I said, well, that's just doing business, because I didn't take it personally. And so then I realized that I took writing personally. And when this teacher criticized me, I took it personally. And then I touched that jaguar, and I realized that I shouldn't take it personally, that he was just this human being who didn't like Bob Dylan's writing. and suddenly I just felt tremendously relieved. There was this sense of incredible relief. Well, I don't have to listen to this guy.
Was there a moment when that happened, when you had that thought in your head and it was like, wow?
Yes, I remember, so I was sitting in my office, and I was, at the time, and this is another part of my life, I was running an alternative energy company. And that particular day, there wasn't much I could do. Construction started. I was the CEO. There was not much I could do. So I just decided I'm going to write a little story about how this whole financing process of financing this big alternative energy plant went through. So I sat and I started to write, and I stopped. And I saw that professor. That was my jaguar. And I closed my eyes right then and there, and I just went into kind of a meditation, and I did that process. What do I want to do? And I want to write. And what's stopping me? This voice of this guy, and he didn't like Bob Dylan. By then, Bob Dylan, you know, accepted as a really great writer. Eventually, won the Nobel Prize in Literature. And so I just this meditation process, I went through and said, well, wait a minute. I don't need to take this personally. Just like I don't take the business people personally. When they turn me down on something, I don't take that personally. I say it's just business. Well, with him, I say it's just his opinion. So once I did that, I felt a tremendous sense of relief, and I started writing. And that day, I started writing a book that became the first book I published, which is called The Stress-Free Habit. It's still out there. You can still get it. You can go to my website, JohnPerkins.org, or it's a thin book, but it's a great little book. It was published by Inner Traditions.
Oh, yeah. Sure, I know.
Yeah, another great publisher that does a lot of those kinds of books, unlike Barracola that focuses more on business and leadership, et cetera.
Right.
But so I just sat there and started writing it, and it became this book. I said, I just want to write stories about my life, that things I've experienced. I wrote about an experience I had as an economic hitman, and basically with a shaman in Ecuador, and another one in Indonesia, and another one in Iran, and those went into the book called The Stress-Free Habit. So and that turned everything around.
So we've got a couple minutes left. What about what's going on right now, and how does that apply with Black Lives Matter and with coronavirus? Any thoughts about how they tie together?
Yes, we're being forced to really look at change. You know, people don't like change. That's a jaguar. That's a jaguar that I think stops all of us at times. I think that's what's kept us locked in this death economy. But now we've all been forced to change radically. And many of us are finding that although it may be inconvenient, and there's been a lot of suffering and the deaths, and I'm not downplaying any of that, we've also found that we can probably live with this to a certain degree. And I tell people, you know, and I do a lot of kind of work with people on webinars and so on. In fact, I've got one coming up at noon today. If people go on my website, JohnPerkins.org, they can participate in these, and I did one with a Mayan shaman a couple of weeks ago in Guatemala, 3 Mayan shamans, 3. And those are all available on video. If you go to JohnPerkins.org, you can become part of this. So where was I? So when I do this, I say, well, you know, you may be sitting at home saying, I hate this self-isolation. I can't handle it for another day. Forget about a month or 2 months or whatever. That's a big jaguar. If you touch that jaguar, it may say, hey, didn't you always want to learn to play the flute? You got a flute. The internet can teach you how to play the flute. Didn't you always want to write a book or read more books, or do all these things that you can open yourself to doing? And I'm finding a lot of people are doing that. And also, as people tune into these programs, they're practicing those 5 steps I defined that are in the book. And if you go to the website, you can get a workbook that goes along with that at JohnPerkins.org. And so it's created this time, and it's forced us to look at this, and it's forced us to look at the terrible inequalities of this death economy. It's not just an economic system that's destroying the resources, it's also one that's causes terrible, terrible discrimination, this amazing unfairness in the way that we treat minorities, that we treat each other, that we treat people, that we're really having to look at the injustice of our social justice system, in fact, of our whole justice system. And so we're really, really being forced to look at our shadow side. And you know, a shadow is created by a solid object. And in this case, the solid object is the death economy. You can call it that. And it's created this huge shadow that we haven't really looked at very much, but we're being forced to look at it now. And it is the cause behind all of the crises that we're experiencing today. They're all symptoms, all these things, the coronavirus, the racial discrimination, those are symptoms of the bigger system. The way you get rid of a shadow is you raise the light, you raise consciousness, you raise awareness. When the light's directly overhead of the object that's causing the shadow, there is no shadow. And I think we're seeing that shadow now, we're understanding that we've got to arrive at a higher consciousness, at a higher awareness of the problems we've caused. And I think people around the world are waking up to the fact that we live on a fragile space station, and we haven't been doing a very good job of navigating it.
Well, I think that's a great way to finish up. John Perkins, author of the famous book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. He's got a new book out now, Touching the Jaguar, Transforming Fear into Action to Change Your Life in the World. JohnPerkins.org is his website. John, thanks so much for being back on the show.
Thank you so much, Rob, and keep doing your great work. I love your show. I love what you're doing. It's so very, very, very important. Keep it up. Keep doing it. I know you will. Thank you so much.
Thank you.